If you think ghosts only exist in stories, then listen carefully, because what happened to me changed my life forever. My name is Ethan. Back in 2019, my friend Jake and I traveled to a small town in Texas to buy an old house. The locals called it Blackwood House. It had been abandoned for more than 40 years. People in the town kept warning us not to go inside, but we assumed they were just spreading scary stories. The moment we pushed open the front door, a blast of ice-cold air rushed out from the darkness. And then we heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the second floor above us. Someone or something was walking up there. Jake looked at me and tried to laugh, but I could see the fear written all over his face. The footsteps from upstairs seemed to be getting closer and closer. The problem was, the house was supposed to be completely empty. We pulled out our flashlights and slowly made our way toward the staircase, made the old wooden stairs creak beneath our feet. When we finally reached the second floor, the footsteps suddenly stopped. An eerie silence filled the hallway. Then, my flashlight swept across the wall. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but right in the middle of it were fresh footprints. They led straight to a closed door at the end of the hall. And the moment Jake touched the doorknob, 3 loud knocks echoed from inside the room. Knock, knock, knock.
The moment we heard those knocks, both of us jumped back. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought the entire house could hear it. Jake slowly reached for the doorknob again, his hand trembling. The door wasn't locked. "Is someone in there?" he called out. No answer. After a few seconds of silence, we slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the room was filled with old furniture, broken chairs, and a thick layer of dust. It looked as though no one had stepped inside for years. But then, my flashlight landed on a wooden chair sitting in the center of the room. And that's when I noticed something horrifying. Across the dusty surface, someone had recently traced a single word with their finger. Leave. The dust around it was untouched, making the message look fresh. Then, at that exact moment, the door behind us slammed shut on its own. Bang!
The door slammed shut with such force that the entire room shook. Jake immediately rushed over and twisted the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I joined him, pulling with all my strength, yet it felt as if someone on the other side was holding it shut. Then the air inside the room suddenly grew colder, so cold that we could see our breath drifting in front of us like white smoke. That's when we heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the corner of the room. We swung our flashlights toward it. An old wooden wardrobe stood there, covered in dust and shadows. The sound was coming from inside. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounded like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. Then the scratching stopped. Silence. A few seconds later, the wardrobe door began to open on its own, slowly, creaking louder with every inch. Jake and I stood frozen, unable to move. And when the door finally swung all the way open, what we saw inside made our blood run cold. The wardrobe door swung all the way open, and for a few seconds, Jake and I just stared at what was inside. There was no ghost, no person, just an old photograph covered in years of dust. My hands trembled as I picked it up and held it beneath the flashlight. The picture showed a family standing together, a man, a woman, and a young girl. But then my breath caught in my throat. There was a fourth figure standing behind them, a face. Its features were strangely blurred, as if the camera had failed to capture it properly. Jake turned the photograph over. Written on the back in faded black ink was a date,
October 13th, 1979. And beneath it, a single sentence. It's still in the house. A cold chill ran through me. Then, from somewhere directly behind us, a voice whispered so softly it was almost impossible to hear. "Yeah, I'm still here." The moment that whisper reached our ears, the photograph nearly slipped from my hands. Jake spun around instantly and aimed his flashlight into the darkness behind us. There was nobody there. The room was empty, and yet both of us could feel it. We were not alone. The air had become thick and oppressive, as if something invisible was standing only a few feet away, watching us. Then, without warning, the door swung open by itself. We didn't waste a second. Jake and I bolted out of the room and sprinted into the hallway. Somehow, the second floor looked even darker than before. Then, we heard it. A child laughing downstairs. Soft, strange, unnatural. The laughter echoed through the house for several seconds, then slowly transformed into the sound of crying. A cold wave of fear washed over me. And that's when something impossible happened. Every light in the house suddenly turned on at once. The hallway, the rooms, the staircase, everything. Bright light flooded the abandoned home. But there was one terrifying problem. That house hadn't had electricity in years. Every light in the house flickered on at once. Jake and I stood frozen for several seconds. It was impossible. That house had been without electricity for years. Then we heard it. Footsteps racing across the second floor. Thud, thud, thud. Fast, light, like a child running toward the staircase. We looked up. At the very top of the stairs stood a small girl. Her long hair hung over her face, completely hiding it from view. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. She just stood there. "Emily?" Jake whispered. The girl slowly lifted her head. But before we could see her face, every light in the house went out. Instantly, the entire building was swallowed by darkness. Then, from somewhere in that black void, we heard the voice of a little girl. Soft, terrified. "Don't go into the basement." The house fell silent. A few seconds later, the same voice spoke again. This time, even quieter. "He's still awake." We ran down the stairs, but the house no longer looked the way it had when we first entered. Dark stains had begun to appear across the walls. The air smelled of rot and decay. It felt as though the entire house had changed around us. Then, Jake's flashlight landed on a door we were certain hadn't been there before. A basement door. It stood half open. And from somewhere below, we could hear the sound of a little girl crying. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of that house and never look back. But there was something else. A strange pull. Something that seemed to be drawing us toward the basement, almost against our will. Slowly, we began descending the stairs. With every step, the temperature dropped. The air became colder, heavier, the darkness deeper. When we reached the bottom, Jake swept his flashlight across the dirt floor. My stomach tightened. Dozens of tiny footprints covered the ground. Children's footprints. They crisscrossed the basement in every direction. But all of them ended at the same spot. A section of the far wall. And written across that wall, in something that looked horrifyingly fresh, as if it had just been painted there moments ago,
was a single name: Emily. Seeing the name on the basement wall made my hands tremble. Jake stared at it for a few seconds before finally saying, "That's her, Emily Blackwood." I moved my flashlight across the wall. There appeared to be something else carved beneath the name, but years of dirt and moisture had blurred the words beyond recognition. Then Jake spotted an old newspaper lying near the wall. It was half rotted, its pages stained with age, but the headline was still readable: 8-year-old Emily Blackwood missing. The article was dated 1979. The moment I touched the newspaper, an icy gust of wind swept through the basement. The temperature dropped instantly. And then, from somewhere directly behind us, we heard the faint voice of a little girl. Soft, broken, barely above a whisper. "They didn't hide me here." Every muscle in my body locked up. Jake slowly turned around, but there was no one there. Then the voice came again, even quieter than before. "They hid him."
After that whisper, a silence fell over the basement so deep that we could hear our own heartbeats. "He said he hid her," Jake muttered. I shined my flashlight on the wall. The soil beneath Emily's name looked different from the rest, as if someone had filled it back in hastily. We grabbed a rusty shovel lying nearby and started digging. With every scoop, more dirt was removed, and a few minutes later, we heard the sound of metal striking wood. Something was buried there. It was an old box. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside was a torn doll, several photographs, and a small diary. But the moment we opened the first page of the diary, both of us froze. Only one sentence was written there. "If you're reading this, he is watching you."
I clutched the diary tightly in my hands. They were trembling. Jake brought the flashlight closer, and together we started reading the next page. The diary belonged to Emily. At first, the entries were completely normal. She wrote about her family, her school, and her friends. But as we turned more pages, her handwriting began to change. The words became crooked and uneven, as if she had been writing while terrified. One page read, "Every night he walks inside the walls." Another said, "Mom and Dad say I'm just having dreams, but he's real." A chill ran down my spine. Then we reached the final page. The moment we read it, both of us froze. Written in large, shaky letters across the page were the words, "Tonight, he's coming to take me." The air in the basement suddenly felt colder. Jake slowly lowered the diary, and at that exact moment, we heard the soft laughter of a little girl coming from somewhere behind us. The moment we heard the little girl's laughter, both of us whipped around. There was no one there. The basement was completely empty, but the air had grown even colder than before. Jake picked up the old photographs from the box, and we started looking through them one by one. The first photo showed Emily standing with her family. The second was from her birthday party. The third showed the entire family smiling in front of the house. Then I noticed something strange. In the background of every photo, hidden in a corner, there was a blurry figure. A tall man, a black coat, a face so distorted that it was impossible to make out any details. He appeared in every single picture, watching, silent, always there. Jake picked up the last photograph, and suddenly all the color drained from his face. "Ethan, how is this possible?" I took the photo and looked at it. The moment I did, my blood ran cold. Because in that That photograph? Jake and I were standing outside the house on the very same day we had arrived. The photograph nearly slipped from my hands. It was impossible. The picture had been taken that very day, yet Jake and I had never taken a photo outside the house. I looked closer. In the photograph, Jake and I were standing in front of the main door. We were wearing the same clothes, carrying the same bags. Even the expressions on our faces were exactly the same as they had been just a few hours earlier. But the real horror was in the background. Standing in the second-floor window was the same blurry man. And this time, his face was much clearer than before. His eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were looking directly at us. A chill shot through my body. Jake slowly turned the photograph over. Written on the back in red ink was a message. Now he knows you're here. My stomach dropped, and at that exact moment, we heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor upstairs. Scrape. The noise echoed through the dragging sound was getting louder. The ceiling of the house trembled as if something incredibly heavy was being pulled across the upstairs hallway. Jake and I stood frozen near the basement stairs. Every instinct told us to run, but fear had rooted us to the spot. Then, suddenly, the sound stopped. The entire house fell silent. A few seconds later, thud. A heavy footstep echoed from above. Then another. Thud. 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 It sounded like someone was walking toward the staircase. Slowly. Deliberately. I raised my flashlight toward the stairs. And that's when we saw it. A tall, dark figure standing in the shadows. It was slowly making its way down the staircase, step by step. Its face was blurred and impossible to... But its eyes were glowing. Jake grabbed my arm and whispered, "Run!" But before either of us could move, the figure stopped halfway down the stairs. The house went completely silent. Then, for the first time, it spoke our names. Ethan. Jake. The moment that figure spoke our names, it felt as if the blood in my veins had turned to ice. It knew who we were. Maybe it had known us for a very long time. Jake and I ran out of the basement as fast as we could. Behind us, the sound of footsteps followed relentlessly, echoing through the house. We raced to the front door and slammed into it with all our strength. This time, it opened. We burst out of the house and sprinted toward the road. Neither of us had the courage to look back. The next morning, Jake sent me a photograph. He was standing in his bedroom, but in the dark corner behind him, the same blurry man was there, watching. A few days later, Jake suddenly disappeared. His phone was turned off. His house was empty. No one knew where he had gone. And then, something even more terrifying happened. I started seeing that same figure in my own old photographs. At first, it was barely noticeable, but once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. That's when I finally understood the truth. It didn't live in Blackwood House. It followed people home. If you enjoyed this scary story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more horror stories. And tonight, take a close look at your old photographs, because maybe someone is watching you too. The end. If you enjoyed this terrifying journey, subscribe to Mr. Nightmare 2.0 and become part of our growing horror community. Sweet dreams, if you